Uh, Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to the Honesty for Ohio Education Youth and Young Adult Council Anti-Racism Workshop. Uh, I just want to say appreciate everybody being here today. I know that there was, the date moved around and things like that, but it's really nice to see a lot of faces here today and just feel the warm kind of community here in this cold fall day in the first day of October. So right at the top, I just want to say my name is Pat Gladera. I use they, them pronouns. I am Honesty for Ohio Education's Youth and Young Adult Organizer. And if you're not familiar with H4OE, we are a coalition of nonprofits brought together to put an end to Ohio's censorship bills, ensure that all students in Ohio have an honest, high quality education or their cultural background, race, zip code, sexual orientation, or religious affiliation, so on and so forth, and protect students at all levels here in Ohio. So that's a little bit about us. I put this together with the help of Fariha, today's facilitator, and Aki Butler from the Ohio Association. So a warm thank you to both of you. And without further ado, I am going to pass it over to today's facilitator.
All right, thank you. Welcome, folks. Excited to be here with you all. My name is Fariha. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, I'll be doing just a lot of movement in the dialogue with you all. That's how I kind of identify as a facilitator. I don't like to lecture and just unnecessarily talk. So I believe in just helping the room move and guide. So please think of me as that. And everybody in this room has knowledge and experiences that are different than mine. And so we are all both, folks who are constantly learning, growing, and teaching one another. So that's really important to me, especially as we do equity work. So with that said, Pat or Aki, do you all have any other announcements or you're good? Okay, sweet. So if we can go to the next slide. All right, so we'll just take a couple minutes because I know we're past 12:05. So this shouldn't be more than like maybe a 30-second reflection, which is not really reflection time. But if you just want to put your name, pronouns, you can just put that in your like rename yourself if that's easier. And then like, where do you go to school if you're attached to a school? Because I know this is young people, but not everybody's attached to a school. Like I'm not necessarily attached to a school, but I am attached to many schools of thought. And then do you need any accommodations? We don't have like any ASL or whatnot, but I think this is helpful for the future as well. So if we can accommodate something like I can add a couple more visuals as people talk or talk louder, etc. I'm happy to do so. So it might not be as inclusive as we would like, but I still want to do what I can. And then where and when have you heard of the term anti-racist? So we'll just start there. And then I'm happy to read the chat out loud because I'm able to see it. So yeah, let's do that. And I will definitely answer in the chat as well. And Aki and Pat, you're welcome to as well if you'd like to do so. All right, and we'll give it like another 60 seconds. And folks that can't answer in the chat, no worries. And if you don't feel comfortable answering, no worries. But it's easier for me to just refer to people when I am able to just make sure their name attaches to like the box on Zoom. So. All right, thank you. And again, you're welcome to really do whatever in the chat if I miss it. Pat or Aki, if you want to just call it out, let me know. But yeah, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I appreciate all of you sharing. And this is just to get us like thinking, if we had like a 2-hour session, I'd have folks share for like 2 minutes, but time is always for me a barrier when I facilitate. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so I moved definitions after I was debating. So that will come up on the slide right after this. But this is kind of where we just have open dialogue. And again, if you're not able to talk or don't feel comfortable and want to put it in the chat, perfect. But let's just popcorn it out. And you can unmute yourself. And if possible, if you want to keep your response to like 60 seconds or under, and I don't like to limit people, but I want to make sure I have like some kind of closure at the end. So if we get too far behind, it might be tricky. So yeah, any of these questions that you want to answer, and then we'll kind of go into definitions, which is tied to Ibram Kendi and his work. So whoever wants to start.
I could start. So the last question, where it's like, where are we at as a society on our journey to anti-racism? I think we're in sort of a pivotal moment. Like, and when I say pivotal, I mean sort of like almost like the kind of like the beginning, because I feel as though now people are trying to be as aware as possible and trying to make sure they're coming from a place of anti-racism, which is good. But now we're getting a lot of pushback from folks because folks are like, well, they don't believe it, or like, well, things have been like this for so long. So I don't know. I feel like we're sort of in the beginning of the journey, but like at a pivotal moment where we have to like push through and like ignore like, I guess, the naysayers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. I really appreciate you sharing and sharing first. Yeah, that's interesting because if you look at the definition and the term and the culture, right, about movement work, obviously there's been movement work like since, I don't know, colonizers arrived, but so we could go that far back, but I really appreciate you saying we're at the beginning and at a pivotal moment, because things that are shot, in my opinion, or my reflection of your feedback, or my feedback of your reflection is like in this moment when there's so much thrown against us, and people are trying to have it stick on the wall, like how do we kind of come in, at this very intersectional moment, right, where there's, and I mean, all kinds of awkward, unnecessary intersections that move us away from a democratic principle society. So yeah, thank you, Aki. Other folks.
I can hop in for the second question. What does anti-racism involve? I think it means something a little bit different for white folks like me. And what does that entail in what we do? And I heard this interesting thing the other day that I hadn't heard before, and it was that within the American system, there is nothing that is not racist. It is either racist or especially in how white folks operate within it. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that when doing this work, that if it's in even any way tacitly supporting the system, then it is racist, because the system is racist. It has to be anti-racist at all times, because there is no like in between. It is one of those things that is a binary. So I just found that interesting, and I came across that the other day.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I'm like really fascinated, because you're right. I think we tread on this in between, or we tell ourselves, like as individuals, if we're doing our own work. We'll talk about a little bit more about that. What is like, oh, we're moving or shifting, or it's not that bad. Like it's an excuse-based strategy to make for comfort. And I don't say that to offend anybody, because I'm just thinking, and I obviously don't know how everybody operates and what they think and believe, and that's not my place anyways. And we do too much judgment in this society, but I really appreciate you mentioning binary, Pat, because I have, ironically, I say so much of America is like obsessed with the binary, like the gender. It's like, it has to be this or this, or, it's just like all or nothing. And so it's funny. So the one thing we don't embrace in the binary, I guess we do embrace it, but we're like stuck here, is like the racist institutions, rather than looking at the world through an equity lens. And what does that equity allow us to do? And, I use the term abolitionist because people are more comfortable, but abolition isn't like burn the building down. And Dorothy Roberts not Dorothy Roberts, but Dorothy Roberts mentioned this, that Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes abolition as like the building of things that are equitable. And, so it's kind of like Pat said, instead of working in the system, how can we kind of move around it? So other folks.
Hi, this is Leah. I put in the chat that I think that it involves constantly working to dismantle systemic racism. And the system is so complicated and pervasive that we need to be constantly evaluating policies, procedures, trends to identify, because as soon as it's like whack-a-mole, right? Like as soon as you identify one issue and work to correct that in becoming an anti-racist society, then there's something else popping up over here, because it's just so ingrained into our culture and our society.
Thank you, Leah. And that's a really good point. And I wonder if that's just like natural consequence of living like immersed in everything that is based on like racist fundamentals, or if that's like a distraction strategy, from the system. But I'm not gonna like chew that up and go into it, because now my brain could go all over the place with thoughts. But yeah, that's super interesting. And you're right. And it's like, can we even really do the work in one area? And I think that for me reaffirms the need to create systems that are equitable and community-based and by the people for the people, in order for us to really cultivate and grow. Because if we keep on doing the work, but the entire system is broken, it's the idea of like reform versus like a restart, which is what I like to call it, like how can you keep on reforming this and then this and this? And it's like, well, it's not really working, right? But we keep on doing the same thing. So, or we try to address one thing, as you said, and there's something like this, it's just nonstop, right? And so I think that's where like the restart comes in. But it also makes me question, like, well, where do you put your energy, as an individual? So thank you. Any other folks want to share out loud or in the chat? And if not, we'll just dive into the definitions. And whoever wants to read those out loud for the group is welcome to do so. All right, so I think we can go to the next slide, which should have definitions. And so this is complex and not appropriate for a very brief hello, touch base, sprinkle dialogue. But I still want to push this up here, because I think I appreciate how it shows like the spectrum, right? So a lot of times we say this, where I was referring to Pat's comment, is in between, like anti-racist racial groups are equal in all the ways they are different. And so it's like, that's what we'd like to believe, right? But that also denies the reality in which we exist. So anybody else want to, let's just do a straight reading across, and then we'll just pause and chat about this a little bit. So whoever wants to read for the group.
I'm down.
Okay, sweet. Thank you. Yeah, if you want to read like across, like assimilationist, all the way across segregationist, and then anti-racist, and then we can hop in, because I did that too prematurely, but it's important to give people time to read and listen. So thank you, Aki.
No problems. So, assimilationist, racist beliefs certain racial groups are culturally or behaviorally inferior. People of color can be developed, paternalistic. Then racist ideas, racial group is temporarily inferior, and then racist policies go toward developing, civilizing, and integrating a racial group. Um, oh wow. So yeah,
Yeah,
do you,
you all want to do thought? Yes, let's pause, because that is really heavy. Even some of the stuff I read, and then when I heard you read it, I'm like, it's overwhelming. So let's pause and chat about this. And Aki, you're welcome to give your thoughts.
So it makes me think about, and like I guess thinking about like the history classes I took about how we would I would say like the US would go over to other countries that they felt were underdeveloped and basically be like, oh, we're helping you become more civilized, you know, do things our way, like democracy is better. And it was like they were forcing them to do things their way and trying to get them to assimilate to what they felt was the right way or the correct way, and sort of dehumanizing, I guess, the other folks.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it reminds me of like, when we used to, and I apologize, I'm like in between two trainings in this secret room. That's not a secret anymore because people keep on knocking. So I apologize. I'm like in the same space, but I had to step away a couple of times so the knocking didn't get too aggressive. But yeah, that's interesting, Aki, because we have the term like first world, third world, and it's the same thing, like the first world needs to offer. It really is, the idea that we need to be colonized. And it's the excuse-based mentality again, I'm just like thinking out loud with you all, like the excuse-based mentality of like, we can like control people because they are inferior. And it goes back to the caste system, which is another really good topic to like just talk about American caste and how that works, like understanding it thoroughly to then be able to dismantle, and create, like, instead of a vertical perspective, create like a horizontal, like moved, I could always call it tilting the line, like going from this and slowly reaching an equilibrium. Other thoughts from people?
I think the first thing I thought of was like the way we talk about like America as a melting pot. Like even as that, like that term is like kind of gross to think about as a metaphor. Like you can melt a culture down until it becomes the same as everything else. And that was just the first thing I thought of about like temporarily inferior. So like the process of being melted is just like, yeah, it's just like kind of giving me like the ick to think about like that even as a metaphor in this kind of like framing.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, and I wonder if it's like supposed to be like this subliminal meaning of like melt and gel with like the dominant Western Anglo culture. That's so, yeah. I think of it like a very interesting salad, but you are right. And obviously, like the dressing can be like overwhelming if it's like supremacy or something. But that's just really interesting, Pat. And it's funny because I used the word assimilation the other day. And I did use it in a very, according to this, like a racist way, that like, oh, well, they're still assimilating to society. But I could have said they're still learning the logistical operations of like how America works, like the public transport, like the systems that they have to like interact with to survive, whether they're healthy or unhealthy. And obviously most of them are at their core unhealthy. So yeah, it's interesting. But, I mean, I'm just saying all this to say, I'm constantly checking myself, even though I'm doing this work and talking about it like multiple days a week. Thank you. So let's do a couple other thoughts. And I did see Nick mention something. and then we'll go to segregationist and anti-racist. Yeah, so let's have folks share some other thoughts on assimilationist. And you can be like, yeah, I don't agree with that. I think assimilation is great. And that's fine, because I really appreciate people who have alternative opinions and are comfortable sharing them. It's not opinions or beliefs, and are sharing them, because there is value to some extent to assimilate, but like looking at it holistically, how does that differentiate from looking at it, you know, in a certain kind of way? So yeah. Other thoughts or disregard or etc. on assimilationist?
I have something that might be relevant. My name's Chera Shedegi, she, her, and I'm a Kent State student. And this, can you hear me okay? Is that okay? This summer, I did a 2-week study abroad to Rwanda with a Peace and Conflict Studies course at Kent. And the point of the course was to really learn about their peace building process after the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. So learning about the whole process with that. What was interesting is some people's first reactions to my going was, are you going to do mission work, or what's like, I'm going to do something for them, as opposed to me going to learn from what Rwandans had done much better than probably almost anyone else in the world, right? And they did that process, but kind of not ignoring, that's not the right word, choosing to do things their own way, rooted in their pre-colonial culture. So it was just interesting how a lot of people's first thoughts were not that I'm going to learn, it was that I was going to educate.
Yeah, that was my first thought too. Or like it's collaboration, you know, but like you bring, in theory, we bring like in the power structure, we bring like the high intellect, you know. That's very interesting. And I'm glad people actually mentioned that to you, because then you can be like, well, actually, and it's, you know, in and of itself, that conversation is really powerful, because then, you know, in the future, when I ask somebody else, like, oh, wait, let me recheck myself and understand that there are people that look at things from a different lens and learning from others. Yeah, and also giving them credit. I think we do like a copy paste and we don't give people credit. And it's, I don't know if interesting is right, but I'm so used to it that it's like really comfortable for me and I don't expect otherwise, but I still feel like there should be a demand, right? If I'm borrowing stuff from other cultures, I should refer to that other culture, etc., rather than just, you know, what I consider like hijacking. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your real life example.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, there were interesting discussions within our own group about what we can learn, but not take. It's not an appropriate application of some of the same peace building processes, or to claim, yeah, that was kind of what you were saying was kind of a second part of what happened. I was just thinking about people's reactions first before I was even going, but even that I don't have a good example right now, but there was some of that, oh, that was a great idea, that worked really well, let's take that and use that in the United States. And some things can and can't, I mean, it's not copy paste, like you said. So that was just an interesting follow-up thing that got me thinking about another part of that trip. Yeah.
And then if we're taking stuff from people, then why is it a melting pot? Because it should be more of a, you know, a casserole. Not casserole, because casserole is like warmed up, but you know what I mean, something raw and organic, and you know, yeah. So there's so many oxymorons, and these are all things I'm just thinking about out loud right now, right? So if we keep constantly borrow, but then we're asking people to melt, it's this idea that this still belongs to us, like you belong to us and your intellect belongs to us, you know. And by us, I mean like that, whatever invisible institutions that are empowered, visible, and same with people, you know, that we see and don't. It's not like one person. That would be more easier to handle. And people often think it's one person, but I think somebody can light the match and then there's already gasoline. all across. So yeah, thank you. And then Aki, are you comfortable reading the next? Oh, hold on. Sorry. I wasn't asking if you're comfortable reading, but I do want to read Nick's comment from earlier. And again, I should have caught this earlier. So thank you, Nick, for your patience. I feel like the word that comes to mind for the second question, and Pat, can you tell me the second question on that intro, not the intro, the question, the first set of questions slide?
Yeah, it was what does anti-racism
Involved. Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, active participation in the sense that anti-racism can't just be passive or internalized. And I really like that because it's always about doing the work, right? And I think that's where we see complacency. Like somebody's like, well, I'm not racist. And it's like, they're just not, like things are not that simplistic. So I really appreciate that, Nick. And that's definitely like a very strong, I feel like, messaging throughout like Kendi and the coin term anti-racist and stuff. I feel like you did a really good job. You just call it active participation in dismantling racism. I feel like would be a good definition for us. So thank you. Do other folks want to read segregationist or anti-racist? And again, I just want to give people room to like be involved and talk. If they don't want to share, this is another way to participate if you're comfortable.
I can read segregationist. That's the next one we're doing. Genetic, racial distinction, and fixed hierarchy. People of color cannot be developed. Racist ideas. Racial group is permanently inferior. Racist policies geared towards segregating, enslaving, incarcerating, deporting, and killing. I can read the next one too, but if we want to talk about this one first, whatever you all think is best.
Yeah, go ahead and give your thoughts, Nathan, if you're comfortable.
Yeah, no, of course. I think my first thought here is that I think I sort of think to the Palestinian struggle right now, to be honest with you, and think through, because I'm Jewish and I know some Israeli people and Zionists who often use the assimilationist language to talk about Palestinian people, like, oh, they behave a certain way, or like, they use this blanket term for Palestinian people are terrorists, and it's their behaviors that is the reason why we need to sort of engage in apartheid. And yet it's not really the behaviors, right? Like there's a lot of really great scholarship and work done by Palestinians that show that Israel is at its core a settler colonial enterprise. So it doesn't matter how the people you're colonizing behave, you're always going to be engaging in those policies towards segregating, enslaving, incarcerating, deporting, and killing. So that's sort of what I'm thinking of right now, is how like a lot of those really like awful kind of like genocidal policies that come out of those segregationist ideas can sometimes be framed as like assimilationist, like we had to do this by colonizers, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that does. And it's really interesting that you brought up the Palestinian, because I mean, there is that usage of like chosen people or people who are allowed to be somewhere, but that can also like apply here, right? In terms of who conquered the land and what they thought about other people, and definitely didn't think they were, like stole all this stuff from them, including like humans as property. And then we're like, oh, well, you're like not very intelligent. And I'm glad that you mentioned this too, Nathan, because it goes back into this culture of like emotion-based culture. And I don't want to get too much into it because it's in the next slides, but that was kind of the premise that Pat and I thought about, like how we should approach this like very initial dialogue. So thank you for mentioning that too. And just your own background and stuff. That's really powerful and interesting, because I don't think that was the first thing. I would have not thought about that as in terms of idea sharing and processes. So thank you. Other folks want to talk about segregationists before we transition to anti-racist and then keep on having these deeper discussions? how pervasive do we think that this is within America, where we say like, we talk about segregation as a historical concept and not like a current contemporary concept. It's like, I mean, I'm not a native to Ohio, but I am, like, I've exclusively been in Columbus, but I know this issue definitely is pervasive all across the country, but I can see this even in our own, like, our own neighborhoods, but our own cities, right? How do they operate and reaffirm segregationist beliefs? And people are like, oh, and they desegregated the school. And that's not to say that literal things didn't happen, but like, why do we see it as a, like, oh, when we were segregated versus like how we are currently still segregated? I'm curious what folks think about that.
I think that's a really interesting question. That instantly sparked some thoughts for me about Ohio specifically, and I don't think he's on today, but I want to give a shout out to Derek Birch and Erase the Space and what they do in like the education they do for young folks around like continued segregation in schools. But even thinking about like gentrification as a process right now, where, you know, white flight happens because people of color are in areas where white folks don't want them to be, so they go to the suburbs, and then people of color gain enough income to buy houses in the suburbs, so they leave the suburbs and go back to the, and it's just like this continued process of like development in areas as a process to segregate without like the like written language of you can't live here or whatever. This it's like longer steps of like zoning rules and property taxes and building developments. It's like, and then processes to segregate schools like we're seeing right now, like making it educational environments that are wholly unwelcome to people of color, makes it so that they're like the only viable option would be to like sort of segregate schools and have like private schools and things like that as kind of a concept to like break down public schools. But sorry, those were jumbled thoughts, but yeah.
Yeah, no, those are really powerful, Pat, because even with like charter schools that cater to like low income kids, it's and again, like there's, you know, I'm very happy to pretend to label all in one like swipe of a paintbrush, but that's not acceptable. But a lot of the idea is like, oh, even when we're serving other kids, we're like, we have more ability to indoctrinate them with certain things. And, you know, I don't see, maybe indoctrinate is not the right word, but push certain ideas or approaches, which is ironic because like the system itself isn't like designed to like is not designed really to like uplift Black and brown students like inherently, and it's not even like modern. Like, you know, it's like we're not, I mean, I'm surprised there hasn't been like reform other than like standardized tests, which obviously is a reform in a way that we are pretending to like move forward. I mean, I think standardized tests is its own category of like awkwardness that could go on forever. But yeah, so that's super interesting. So it's like, is the system not enough? Like, and like, no, it's not enough. We need to like do it something else to help people. And it still goes in this power structure, this dynamic. And I used to work in a charter school, and I really believed in the movement. And of course, I've significantly changed my view. And that's even with this idea that I understand the systems in which I do work are like inherently not there for like people. But then I think about relationships, right? Like I could homeschool my kids, but I can't homeschool everybody's kids and have everybody's mom involved. And everybody can't afford that. And I can't literally afford that either, like financially or in my sanity, like capacity of like tolerance and patience. So I haven't done all the work I need to do for my own healing, but that's super interesting. I'm glad you mentioned, and like there are certain things that are real, like redlining, you know, like and if you look at infant mortality, it goes back to this geographic issue of like housing and development, right? Like they haven't found anything, like with all this billions of dollars, maybe it's not billions, but millions of dollars spent on like seeing why the infant mortality in Columbus is like notorious. I think we're like second to the bottom after a small city in the South or something or whatever, but it's like, it doesn't make sense. But then if you look at like instability and movement, right? literal movement and like metaphorical. It's like really obvious, like, oh, well, if people don't have stability because you keep on pushing them around or raise taxes in a Black neighborhood or historically Black neighborhood, or imprison people or punitively punish their kids or just like re-engage in their trauma, it's like, well, how are people supposed to survive and thrive? And now you can add the whole layer of like choice and all of that, you know? So yeah, it's super interesting. Thank you, Leah. I do think housing is really important. And I've talked about like, if I was to buy a house in Columbus, where would I buy a house? And my partner was like, well, even if we buy a house in this neighborhood, it's still gentrifying, even though like we're part of this ethnic group. And so, and I say that to say, like, as a brown second generation, like new American person of color, is still like, I'm not removed from this. I might have like different insight because I see how the system affects me, but it doesn't mean like I'm so entangled in like it's a spider web. So how many like I can't really fall out of it, right? So I just say that to just be open about like how I'm constantly doing the work. Like that's why I mentioned like my example of I literally use the word assimilation, you know, and I didn't use it with somebody that was coming at it in a negative way, but they were talking about somebody and I didn't want to say it rudely. So I'm like, well, people still have like a journey to assimilate, but I should have been like, well, understand and learn these systems which are foreign to them because they haven't been in the US for X number of years. So I could definitely have rephrased that. So thank you. Thank you folks for sharing. I'm trying to see what other folks wrote. Yes, we see it in schools, prisons, language, and actions for some immigrant value over others. And that's super true. And it's like, you know, some schools are like immersion schools. And it goes back to what I said, like, well, how are you going to promote immersion, like Chinese immersion or Mandarin immersion or Arabic or whatever? Like Spanish definitely is more common. But I'm like, and then you're like, oh, you still need to be part of the melting pot. You know, it's not like, oh, our kids need to embrace Spanish so they can be culturally competent. Our kids need to embrace Spanish because they are going to be more marketable and intelligent, you know, and then we can dominate Spanish culture or whatever, right? And again, I don't think every principal, and I love people who work in the school, so I'm one of them, right? But it's not to down anybody or say somebody has this like evil intent, but again, it's like this, you work in a system that isn't healthy, how much can you do, right? And that's why I just think people need to understand what dismantling looks like and understand abolition isn't some crazy freak like intense movie type thing. It's like very real. It's like, how do people feel safe and how do we take care of each other? And it's, you know, it's just, I think, very fundamental principles that are fully based in democracy. So Nick, thank you for mentioning a lot of stuff. I'm going to read it. This is prompting me to think of the different frameworks between segregationists and assimilationists as applied to different immigrant and racial groups, where I feel like segregationist is very casually used even by liberals about immigrants from Central and South America. Biden has to get control of the border so Democrats don't lose the midterms, versus assimilationist I hear very often applied to AAPI folks. You belong here. Yes, that's so true. And as an AAPI person, I definitely understand this, what's imposed. If you do X, Y, Z and adapt to American culture, you know, the idea is that you can make it, right? And even when you make it, you don't make it because just like you never really, like I'm not going to be Anglo. I can't, right? It's literally and otherwise. And it says Japanese and Chinese people were explicit targets. Yes, the Exclusion Act internment counts. And I think about even like the indigenous folks that were like, we're legit going to strip your culture. Like it's not even like, it was just like straight up pervasive. And it wasn't, I mean, I don't even know what word I'm trying to use, but it was super explicit and upfront. It wasn't like some low-key agenda. So yeah, thank you. And I'm also like a super rambler, so anybody who's apologizing, don't apologize, but I really appreciate this and it's really interesting, and you're right, and it's how we see people, groups of people, and therefore if we see them a certain way, then we're allowed to act a certain way towards them, right? Or allow like or allowed to assume like they can, here's like our neighborhood and they can live all around the neighborhood, you know, which is why Derek, who Pat referred to, I was like, oh, in this area I live in, there's like a lot of like mixed income, and he was like, well, that's domestic help that you still live there. Like that's why you have like this really affluent neighborhood and all these like this circular pattern, because like their house help live there. And maybe even if they want to live in their neighborhood and there wasn't redlining, well, there is, because like how are they going to afford that, right? So yeah, very interesting. And yeah, I think housing is like I think it would be an interesting conversation to have. Kerwin talks a lot about housing. And yeah, and there's people within Curwen that talk a lot about like geographic intersections with other things, like, you know, geography and food insecurity and all of that. So yeah, I feel like we think of like new topics for future conversation. So thank you. And then who wants to read Anti-Racist? And then we'll keep it moving because I just realized it's 12:45. And I was like, people aren't sharing as much. And then I was like, oh, well, it doesn't matter because we're not going to get to the end. So continue to share, especially if we don't get to, please share in the chat. But I definitely want room for everybody who would like to share. No pressure to do so. But who wants to read Anti-Racist? And then we'll spend a couple minutes on this and then kind of try to fly.
I can hop in and read this one. Anti-racist, racist belief. Racial groups are equal in all the ways different. Racist ideas, or I guess these are different categories. Disregard the categories. To be anti-racist is to emancipate oneself from the dueling consciousness, knowing there is no such thing as the American body, only American bodies racialized by power, and geared toward reducing equities and creating equal opportunity, mass equalizing.
Yeah. And this I think is a little bit harder because there is, I can like share this document. It's like a summary of Ibram Kendi's latest book. I've, just to be transparent, I've only read Stamped, and I think a lot of people have read it. So I'm probably in the norm here, and people probably have read more of his work than I have. But yeah, I think some of this is confusing. But this is dueling consciousness. Was mentioned earlier, and again, it refers to the book. So yeah, like the American body goes back to what Pat was saying with the melting pot. Like you still have to melt and infuse into this like blob, you know, culture, but not, and then it's like really confusing. And racist policies are geared towards reducing racial inequities and creating equal opportunity. Yeah, and I think it's this conversation of equal versus equitable, right? And I love when people show like graphics or videos about that, like, because it really helps people understand, right? Like if, like I've always seen the race one where somebody's starting here and somebody's starting like off the screen and you're like, well, I can't catch up. It's like, well, work harder. And there's a saying like work harder for half the pay. Like people of color have to work harder for half the pay. And then we're still like not winning the race, right? And if we do, it's like tokenized or, you know, just like what you did it, so all your people can do it, or, you know, and again, I think about how much I allowed this bootstrap culture to influence myself as an Asian American. And also like as just somebody who's like trying to promote and uplift like people who are young people who are like, feel like all their confidence and abilities have been stolen away from them, like explicitly or implicitly, like depending on if, you know, what kind of, like if they're in a school or in a prison. And so yeah, really interesting. I'm like, I should have spent like 3 hours writing notes about these definitions. But let me pause and let other folks share, like 1 or 2 other folks, and we'll just jump right into the next. I think we have like 3 or 4 more slides, but each of them are pretty intense. So we'll jump into that dialogue.
So like I think the thing that's really hits for me with this is like the racist belief where it says like racial groups are all equal in all the ways they are different, because that's something that like I don't know, I guess that's something that I always felt like I always was able to appreciate other people's identities and like also their cultures and different things like that. And I always yeah, like sort of what you just said, like it does make me think of like separate, but what was separate but equal should have truly meant. Like, yeah, you know, things may be a little different, but it's still like equal and there's still equity and like people are like, I guess, sort of like supported. So like, I don't know, I guess in a way, I guess I've always believed in anti-racism. I guess this maybe didn't know like the definition or whatever it like was, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm glad you tied it back to the other ones, right? Because like there's a gap here, but in a chart, but that's intentional because it's, you know, like these two things, and then how do you move to anti-racist? Yeah. And again, if you look at assimilation, and segregation strategies, right? Because one of them is like, oh no, like we're not segregating, we're asking people to be involved, but they have to do it our way. And you know, which is why it says paternalistic. So yeah, like the American body, only American body is racialized by power. Yeah, and I love that. Other thoughts that folks want to put in the chat as we move on, please feel free to do so. And the bulk of what I really want to get to is like, not even this slide, but how we often see, I'm not going to say it because I'm interested to see how people respond without me kind of tainting your response or making you think a certain way. So whoever wants to, we'll have one or two folks respond to these questions, any of them, or how does our society respond to anti-racism? I guess I didn't put our, but the society that we know. What are the other ways to respond to anti-racism, which builds off that first question? And then what is underneath the racism itself, which builds off both, but you're welcome to answer any for the sake of time. So whoever would like to answer in the chat or in real time, please do so. And then we're gonna probably go to the next slide in 2 minutes and then just go boom, boom, boom throughout.
I feel like when I see the first question about how does society respond to anti-racism, I feel at times it responds very negatively, if that makes sense. Like even when I think about like the House bills that are in Ohio, like you see people actively trying to do like anti-racism and trying to do that work, and then you have folks responding in a manner that's like, oh, like they respond as if it's an attack on them, as if you're like attacking them instead of what you're actually attacking. And it's like, so I feel like if you feel like this is an attack on you, then maybe you need to do some reflecting, because like how does the world saying, hey, we want to be anti-racist and we want to make sure we're inclusive mean, oh, we hate you and we think you're a racist? Like, I don't get that, but yeah, that's how I sort of feel society responds to anti-racism.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that we respond negatively, because I like maybe in this space we're like, oh, we all love it, right? I mean, that's not to say I don't know everybody, and even if I knew you, I don't know what's like how you are on the inside, or like how you're perceived or how you appear and how you really feel and believe. But thank you for sharing that, because you're right, it is negative, and people that are in this like bystander or culture are like, oh, like they're even uncomfortable. It's like the majority is uncomfortable, but like, why are they uncomfortable? And if we respond by like shutting it down, then like, what are other ways to respond to it? That's just that you see in society, or maybe that you think is how it should be responded to. So we'll just keep it up for one more person, and then please jump in the chat. I've been talking more than I would like to talk. So I definitely want to give space to other people.
I will just say for other ways to respond, what's coming to mind is like good faith, like responding anti-racism with like good faith and embrace. I know that's kind of like pie in the sky or whatever, but I think that's what I would hope for, is that people are approaching the ideas with like earnest and
Yeah. I like that. And I like how it's not very specific. So thank you for that. I'm not going to comment on it with my own thoughts, but and think out loud. But if anybody else wants to share, please go ahead and drop in the chat and we'll go to the next slide. I hope this is the one I'm trying to get to. So yeah, let's have somebody respond, and then I'll kind of take my piece and probably do like 3 or 4 minutes of talking, and then we'll go to the last slide. And I realize this is rushed because the bulk of what I wanted to discuss was like this. So I apologize for tightening it up, but I'm happy to have resources or conversations offline that Pat or I or even Aki can kind of help with, depending on our capacity, or at least send you something. So I do want to offer that, at least on my end. I didn't even ask you to, but I'm like, just talk to one of us. Okay, so yeah, who would like to kind of open this up? Like, how are we racist? And so this is like we collectively, and then we like each of us. And it's important, well, I'm going a little bit ahead of myself, but like I want to also answer each of us, because that's what we talk about in the next slide, like doing our own work. So like what is, and you don't have to say like I'm racist in this way, you can just use a general term, but think of we, society, and I, myself. And that kind of answers the first 2 questions.
I mean, what this is making me think of right now is sort of like, you know, like movements to build pipelines on indigenous lands, and like the constant, you know, murders of Black people by police in like cities all over the US, and just like all these things that are like, they sometimes make national news and sometimes don't, that kind of like remind me at least that like the society we live in is like racist to its core, and like it will continue, you know, acting on those racist principles, you know, if I don't do anything. So like when I think of anti-racism versus racism, it's always about like action versus inaction. And like you were saying earlier, like if you're not doing the work all the time, you're sort of allowing a racist project to continue. You know, so sort of what I'm thinking right now is like, you know, racism isn't like necessarily always like a set of like beliefs. It's like if you're not doing anything to combat a society that's actively racist, especially if you're somebody like me, you're white, you benefit from that, then, you know, you're participating in a racist system.
Yeah, thank you. That's powerful. And I appreciate that. It's kind of goes to this like in between this person that is not really doing anything. Whose side are you leaning on? I just forgot a quote that I was going to say that people are probably really familiar with. Like if you're a bystander, you're on the side of the oppressor or something. But yeah, other folks. Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, I would say, so like thinking of the entire spectrum, I think that thing like I guess society as a whole, like just sort of like how I was mentioning before about respecting other people's cultures and their beliefs and things of that nature. I think oftentimes society does not, which is sad to say. I think it's like the little things, like when you like try another culture's food, and like instead of like, for instance, you might try something that you may not like. Like I try things I don't like. I'm just like, not for me. But I know that some people might make a face and they're like overly dramatic or like, ill, what's that? Things like that. Like I don't think people realize like the sort of racism that like holds. And then like I would say, there's also a bit of like internalized racism, because like it's, for instance, when you think of certain cities, it's like people are like, oh, I don't really go over there because it's like dangerous over there. Mind you, they probably have never been over there. They probably don't know much about the area, or if they are over there, it's like, oh, locking the doors, or like seeing someone like, oh, that guy looks creepy, and it's like this person's just walking and minding his business. So it's like the subtle things that I think sort of like it shows up in everybody, and it shows that we all like, you know, have like work to do in order to like sort of break that.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate those really specific examples. And I'm glad, because you're right, because somebody might say, I'm not racist, I just don't like it. But I don't like it because it's gross and it's other and it's inferior, right? And I'm even thinking about like how in the culture that I grew up and in the class that my parents grew up and my grandparents was very different than like socioeconomically than where I was at, even in their respective like countries of origin. And so the things I say like this, yeah, it's just like the colonial mindset of like, well, why would you even eat that? Or that's gross, or you're not poor anymore and you don't have to, you know what I mean? And it's like, yeah, and it's the lack of respect that really is racist, because it's like, well, why, like, how dare you eat that and then think you're good enough for, you know, I mean, it goes deeper into that. So I really appreciate this very specific example. And you're right, it's whoever said the active piece earlier, it's like the active work, like checking yourself as an individual when you go there, right? Or if you are close enough to a friend, like checking your friend. And often the question I kind of want to ask really quick, if people are comfortable, and maybe I'll just ramble on after that, but like we often try to respond. What I would really want to get at in this workshop, which I'm going to get at in this last 3 minutes of the workshop, is when we respond to people, we often respond with facts, right? And facts are relative. And I don't believe that, but people believe that. But I also don't believe their reality, and their reality can be fact. So it's like, how do we see? One of the things I say is like reality is perception. So if somebody else feels this way, then what is their fact and what is mine, right? Like oh, misinformation, but some people really believe that. And is it just access to quote unquote real facts, or is it that people fluctuate and go and lean in towards a space where they are comfortable and it meets their needs. And how many of those needs are based in fear, right? If we get down to like each individual person and understand that a lot of this work in racism isn't just like I can't just expedite the process of somebody being anti-racist by giving them a book. Like, are they ready for it? How much fear do they have, right? I'm not a counselor, but I am in a relationship with a lot of people. It doesn't have to be, it can be a platonic relationship, a working relationship, right? And it's not that you have to like convert somebody, because then that also assumes you know what you're doing, but like, how are we helping people really belong? And how are we addressing the fear, including in those that are at the top of, you know, straight, cis, Anglo men? How are we addressing that fear? And even those individuals who we think are privileged, right? They may or may not be privileged, that's not the conversation. But like, if we look at things from a lens of emotion and not from logic, then we can really understand why we haven't shifted, because information in and of itself is relative and it's not enough. So that's kind of like the underlying piece I kind of want to get to, is understanding fear and understanding that the relationships that you build intimately and individually allow somebody to move past that fear and belong. And then it gives them the allowance to like do whatever they want, understand anti-racist principles, decolonize their work, whatever, right? So that's kind of the bottom line. I don't know if the other slides, we can just run through them. I'm not going to really talk about them, but I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. This is like zones of growth for yourself. And I think if we're like, we can only do the work of others if we're always doing the work ourselves, with others, not of others, if we're always doing the work ourselves. So even with me, people are like, oh, you always talk about equity. I do, because it's like I get paid for it and people are interested in it today, but I'm not necessarily like, I'm not done with it, right? Like I'm not done with my own equity work and decolonizing. And so understanding and being compassionate with people that are not on your side, you know, whatever that side means to you in your zone of beliefs, and coming at them with compassion and understanding that we all operate out of some emotion, I think is the most powerful tool, and also will address us in shifting and looking at things from a one-on-one lens and from seeing everybody's humanity, even if they deny you of yours. So I will stop with that. Check out this diagram on your own time, but understand that you are equally responsible for doing the work every single day and checking yourself every single day, as much as you are for moving society along, or assuming that your place is to move society along, but our place is really to only move ourselves, and then see how we can hold people's hands and move them, and then we create a horizontal landscape. So that's what I will end with. If you have questions, you can drop them in the chat. I'm happy to stay on for like a couple more minutes. Otherwise, my name, I changed it on here, but I can put it in the chat, and then you're welcome to reach out to me for any questions. Read Brown Kendi, and or just keep on doing your work. So thank you so much for being here. And I will just pause and give it back to Pat.
Thank you.
Question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Fariha. Thank you so much to everybody who made it on today, from the bottom of my heart, my working heart, from Honesty, from all of YYA, from Aki and I. This has been so great. I really appreciate it. I am to get on my own personal soapbox for just a minute. I really appreciate that what we were able to bring together into this room today, because even though it was small, I felt like we had a really rich conversation with everybody, and people brought different perspectives and ideas that I think were really beneficial. And I just loved hearing what everyone had to say. And in this parting idea of approaching things from an emotional framework and mind, I put it in the chat, but I think it in and of itself is a kind of a shirking of the heteropatriarchal lens that we tend to approach things from, or the white heteropatriarchal lens. So thank you so much, Fariha. I will stay on for a few minutes if people have any final questions as well. But other than that, thank you so much, and I will end the recording.
Thanks, Pat. And if you want to go to the last slide really quick before you end, just to have that quote. Yeah. So I'll leave people with this, read it yourself, but it just talks about doing the work actively every day, and that we have the ability to shift ourselves and therefore shift others. So yeah, I think the work is in what we do every day and how we operate in all our relationships. So that is as part 2 of my long ending. And thank you, Pat. I appreciate being here and being invited. And I was like, oh, we're not gonna have enough time. I'm gonna do 5 slides. And I went back and forth with Pat. So I appreciate your patience too. And then I'm like, oh no, we didn't have time anyway. So thank you, even though I left it kind of on some kind of cliffhanger, but just understand that we have to put out compassion, understand fear, and that's where the real work is. So thank you. And I put my email in there, and I'm happy to turn off the recording, or I'm cool with you turning off the recording now that we have this slide. And yeah, I'll stay on for like 1 more minute. I have to hop back into a training at 1:30.